Hey guys! Okay, so today we're going to go over some of the evidence for evolution. So evolution is this theory that scientists have, and there was a lot of different people who really didn't believe the theory. So just like in any theory with science, scientists really had to look for a lot of evidence to prove this theory or hypothesis about evolution was correct. Alright, so to start off, we're going to look at a few different pictures, and for each picture or pair that appears on your note sheet at the top, you're going to write down what is similar and different about the two animals. Try to be specific about what you see in the picture and also what you know about the animals. Take about 1 minute with each picture. Okay, here is the first one. A whale and a dog. So take 1 minute, write down what you see that could be similar about the two animals, or what you know about the animals that's similar, and then write down what's different on that first part in your notes. Take about 30 more seconds. Okay, let's move to the next one. Insect and bird. Really think about what you know that's similar and what you know that's different, because this is something that a lot of scientists had to do when they're thinking about evolution, because they're trying to prove that two different animals have evolved or changed from a common ancestor, from a common animal. So really think about what could be similar, what could be different. Take about 10 more seconds. Okay, the next one, a horse and a cow. So hopefully you'll see a few more similarities here than differences. But think about what's similar and what's different for these two animals. Take about 10 more seconds. Okay, the last one is kind of interesting. It's different human races. You can see a picture on the bottom of the slide. And I wanted to share this fact with you, which is really interesting that some people don't know because race is so embedded, it's so deep in our thoughts as something that is really biological when really we've kind of constructed race. So scientists have found by comparing DNA that the majority of variation differences amongst different human races is found within a population, so within one race, and only a little bit of differences between races. So for instance, roughly 85% of differences in DNA among humans is found within a race, and 15% of differences between races. That means within a race, like within white people, there are actually more differences in DNA than between two different races, which is kind of interesting. So you can write down just what's similar, what's different between different races for humans. Okay. So we went through all of that because we're trying to figure out, just like scientists have been trying to figure out how to show that different species or different animals have evolved, have changed from one common animal. So scientists have really used different data to piece together evidence to show that organisms have evolved from one common ancestor. That's what they're trying to prove when they're trying to prove evolution. So this is the first part of your notes. So like I said, the purpose of looking for all this evidence for evolution is to find something called a common ancestor between different species. So a common ancestor is a relative, just like an ancestor in your family, a relative from which two or more different species evolved from. So we can see a common ancestor in something called an evolutionary tree. An evolutionary tree is sort of like a family tree, and it shows how related different species are to each other. So I'll show you an example of an evolutionary tree. Here's a tree right here, and you can see that the wolf at the top is the common ancestor. Then you can see different branches because different animals have evolved a little differently, have changed from the wolf based on their environment. So you can see on the right that there's modern wolves over there, and then on the left there's different types of dogs. The way you read this tree is that the animals that are closest to each other on the branches that are next to each other on the same branch are the ones that are most similar. So here on this tree, the herding dog and the hound dog are the most similar animals on this tree. But it's showing that they all have evolved from a common ancestor, the wolf ancestor. Alright, so now we're going to go into the different pieces of evidence that scientists refer to prove that evolution has happened. So the first piece of evidence is just fossils. This is the simplest thing that scientists have done. They've gone through rock layers and looked at different fossils in different rock layers and have seen that the fossils are from the same organism and have seen that the fossils have changed over time. So they'll take fossils from different rock layers, which means they're from different time periods, and they'll show, okay, this fossil is one way in this layer, but in the next layer, or the next time period, it has changed slightly. So that shows that that organism is changing over time. It is not staying exactly the same. So for them, that was the simplest piece of evidence to take because we've already got these rock records that we're looking at, and now we can just look at the fossils to see if they've actually changed over time for the same organism. Okay. The second piece of evidence that scientists look at is structural evidence. So structural evidence involves looking at the structures, so the bone structures of different species. So many species scientists have discovered have actually had similar bone structures. So if you look at this picture, it's showing different species, humans, horses, I think a bat, bird, and a whale, and then that's a cat in the middle. And they're looking at the arm, and the scientists are seeing that the arm structure is very similar in these different species. So what scientists do is they study these different structures or different bones of animals, and they see how similar the structures are to each other. If they have similar structures, that means they must have evolved or changed from a common place. Okay, they must have some sort of common ancestor if they have a similar structure to different species. Okay, so there's three types of structures that scientists have discovered. The first structure is called a homologous structure. Homologous structure. Homologous structures are body parts of different organisms that have the same structure but not the same function. The root homo means the same, so homo structures means the same structure, but they don't have the same function. However, because they have the same structure, it indicates, it shows that there's a shared ancestor between the two different species. So let's take an example here in this picture. Birds and bats, the bird is on the left, the bat is on the right, and frogs, which is not in this picture, have the same bone structure for their arms. However, their bones have different functions. So we call their arm structures homologous structures. This shows to scientists that these different organisms must have evolved from a common ancestor because they have similar structures. Even if their structures don't have the same function, if they have similar structures, they must have come from a similar or common ancestor. Okay. The second type of structure scientists look at are structures called vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are body parts in the body that do not play a role in the body functions of an organism anymore. This again indicates that the two organisms must have come from a common ancestor because they have the same structure. So for example, humans have an appendix, but we don't use our appendix. You can get it removed if you need to, and it's fine. You'll be fine because we don't actually use the appendix. Other animals, other species have an appendix, and the fact that two different species have this structure in their body shows that we maybe came from a common place, came from a common ancestor. So the second structure is this vestigial structure, a body part that does not play a role, doesn't have a function anymore in the organism. Again, it indicates we came from a common ancestor. The third type of structure, and the last one, is called an analogous structure. An analogous structure are body parts that have a similar function, so they do the same thing, but they're not similar in structure. The root ana, A-N-A, that root is kind of means like against or different. So an ana structure, an analogous structure, is a different structure, but the same function. So because the structure, the way the bones are laid out, is different, that tells scientists, okay, these two organisms did not come from a common ancestor. So if you look at the picture, the wing of a butterfly and the wing of a bird, they both serve to help the organism fly, but they must have evolved separately. They don't have a common ancestor because the two structures look nothing alike in terms of bone structure, bone placement. So we call them an analogous structure. So different structures even though they have the same function. And because the structure is different, it means the two organisms must have evolved separately. They did not come from a common ancestor. Okay, the third piece of evidence that scientists use is developmental evidence to support the fact that organisms are related to each other, that they must have evolved from a common ancestor. So what scientists use is something called embryology. Embryology is the study of embryos, and an embryo is an organism in the early stages of development. So when the organism is in the womb. So scientists study embryos to see similarities of embryos between different species. Embryos of related organisms are going to look similar. They're going to develop in the womb in similar ways. So if you look at the picture, there's a few different organisms here, and it's showing embryos of the different organisms at different stages in the womb. And you can see they're sort of developing in a similar way. So that for scientists shows that the organisms are related to each other. They must have evolved from a common ancestor to look that similar as an embryo. Okay, so you've got human, cow, all these different organisms in the embryo, so in the womb, and they look similar. So for scientists, that means they must have evolved from a common ancestor. Okay, the last and actually strongest piece of evidence scientists have for evolution to show that organisms have evolved from a common ancestor over time is genetic evidence. So genetic evidence is when scientists examine DNA. So they're going to actually look at DNA to see if there are similar strands of DNA in different organisms. Remember, DNA is your genetic material. It determines an organism's traits. So if DNAs are similar, the organisms are going to be similar. It can definitely show that the organisms evolved from a common ancestor. So basically, scientists have found that different species have very similar DNA patterns, and that means those species must have evolved from a common ancestor. Again, this is the strongest piece of evidence for evolution.